themselves. I am not sure for who the audience for Macron, the prime minister, the president of, I don't know why I insist on making him prime minister, the president of France's declaration was clearly for a domestic audience, not Algerians, or it certainly would fall on deaf ears, I would imagine. So I guess right now one could argue that the politics of apology really has become a cynical political exercise, while trying to hold on to the fact that apology as a form of recognition is extremely important, and like anything can be used instrumentally, but that we shouldn't, especially from the British, I suspect, because I'm not a British historian, so I shouldn't. But it's interesting because I can imagine a debate here when and if that should happen, because it will make all the people go nuts in Britain. I mean, they're dealing with another self-inflicted wound at the moment, but to do this would be called a political distraction, perhaps, if it actually happened in the next 10 days. But it also would. You can imagine a debate between people who thought it was necessary and important for reasons of recognition, finally, right? Too late, but maybe not too little. And yet you can also imagine people making the argument that this is cynical, that this is, and I'm sure this would be debated here quite a lot. What was the motivation of Cobb? What was Cobb's motivation? Just to push?
You mean of Jallianwala Bagh? It was just, it was a peaceful gathering, I think.
This happened in 1919 because the British had, in the context of the First World War, and the sort of agitations, peaceful agitations in different parts of India for more rights, not self-determination. So the British had actually promulgated a sort of censorship, an ordinance called the Rowlatt Act, which were very acts of control. And there was a gathering in Amritsar, in this place called Jallianwala Bagh, which was a peaceful agitation, and a British military general, and Michael O'Dwyer, he just ordered firing, indiscriminate firing on a peacefully agitating crowd. After locking the gate, yes. Yes, so that, and so that became one of the symbolic acts of the British atrocities. But surprisingly, the British actually hailed General O'Dwyer as a hero. He was put on trial, and the British actually raised money to defend him in his trial. So this year is the centenary. And one of India's parliamentarians named Shashi Tharoor has actually demanded that the British acknowledge their guilt by symbolically apologizing to the Indian public and paying reparations for 200 years of imperial rule by paying a reparation of 1 rupee.
No, the 1 rupee is a genius, rhetorical genius. I mean,
yes.
that's really that's the very
exactly.
clever part.
I had a question, Caroline. I thought, you were talking about a time 1920s down to 1940s is of course the decade when the term genocide first gets coined. But this is also a period when you have concepts of a just war, because the wars of the 1890s, previous wars, the carving of Africa, Sino-Japanese War, Russo-Japanese War, the Boer War, they were all straightforward imperialist wars. And there is nothing that goes on in the colonized parts of the world that gets termed as even a crime against humanity. Belgian atrocities in Congo, Mark Twain writes this book called King Leopold's Soliloquy, but people don't recognize that as mass atrocities. So, but in 1914, you have a just war because it's a war waged to make the world safe for democracy. You have the question of fixing of responsibility for the war, reparations on Germany. There is a question of justice and redemption going on at this time. And then you have these instances of a just killing, of a just murder, in a sense, because they were really murdering people who were mass murderers in their own right. But in the trials, so and you said that they were not really straightforward heroes, because if they were, it would be very simple, because justice is very simple. It's like what we see in the Marvel comics, the justice in the Avengers in Marvel comics. But this is complicated because they are things like they are like damaged goods. Like they are people who are temporarily out of their minds, and therefore they are driven to make these murders. And so why in a situation in which we talk a lot about just war and just killing, why are these people not straightforward heroes? It makes sense from a legal point of view to plead temporary insanity, but how does this gel with the perspective taken by the witnesses themselves or the communities themselves who are the victims? Why doesn't it fit?
Oh, it actually, these are for the public. So the Armenian community, on the one hand, I don't know if Telyyan was a hero for, say, prior generations in your family, for example, but he was a hero for the Armenians, obviously, and the same thing with the Jew. There is it's in Israel, apparently, there is you see this, the Avengers Street, is a street in Beersheba, and it clearly he was recognized, and Hannah Arendt wrote about these trials without saying very much, but she criticized the Eichmann trial by saying that these guys were the real deal because they actually took the risk into their own hands of their own lives and their own freedom. She doesn't put it that way. And the Israelis, when they kidnapped Eichmann, she said, didn't do that because nobody had to risk anything to kidnap him. It was so, without getting into Hannah Arendt's argument, obviously, but she says nothing more about them. And if you go back to the trials, then what you find is a lot of information about the community response and a lot of anxiety on both sides about how. So Telyyan is arrested, and he gets very nervous because he doesn't know. The idea was never for the fact that he was an assassin to come out, right? Because the whole point was to kill these Turkish architects of genocide. It was not to be caught. And so when he was caught, it was crucial that they decided to stage it as a recognition of the genocide, so to bring it to a world. And what I didn't talk about here and I deal with in the book is the press coverage of both. And it was all aimed at making Western publics, in one case a French, in another case a German, but this was covered in papers in the United States, in Britain, etc. These cases were covered extensively, and the way they were covered was, wincing at the verdicts, because after all, you're letting murderers go free. And on the other hand, how can you not? I mean, given the sufferings that were detailed in court, suddenly the Armenian genocide becomes a real thing that people experience. And it again, these trials in particular do not break the mold. And that's, again, like all the details of the civilizing mission. By that I mean that the prism through which these guys are seen, as you can imagine from some of the things I said, are, the ancestral race of the passive Jew. Because he spends time in the French army, he can no longer stand the passivity with which Jews have normally approached their enemies. The Armenian guy that basically, plays he becomes very passive on the stand. He sort of plays that he's disoriented, that he has this whole story about his mother. Now, he was traumatized. I mean, his family was murdered. Nonetheless, this is all a lot of orchestration on the part of Jews in Paris, for example, were very worried that the trial was going to increase anti-Semitism. And of course, what the reason he won is primarily because of the anti-Semitism of the Russians who went on trial and who said that the pogroms were divinely inspired vengeance. So this shocked juries. So I think that basically you were dealing with a presumed public sentiment that violence wasn't so good. These people were not going to be heroes in the way Lemkin said, Schwarzbard's crime was beautiful, right? That was why I included him, because he says it's beautiful, and he says Talleyrand was acting as the conscience of mankind. Now those are victim communities that understand. I don't mean to say they're victims. I just mean they are communities that identify with victims. So of course they're heroes to these communities. But how do you represent these crimes to a general public who allied with the Turks during the war, who have to deal with questions of German complicity in a genocide? And the lawyers very, very carefully do not try to steer the trial away from German complicity and make the avenger noble. And in the process, they have to turn him into an avenger that is somehow, whose vengeance becomes acceptable. And that's really what's so difficult about these trials, is not to just make them, they're already morally very complex, but, so these are smart lawyers, essentially. Sure. Does that make sense? I don't know if,
yes,
yeah.
Yes. Yes, okay, so we will have a last question. Please make it brief.
Since you referred to the Strasbourg Convention, there was some incident in 2004. Azerbaijani lieutenant, he was convicted of murdering his counterpart from Armenia, and that the convict was sent in Budapest, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment by the Hungarian court. Because of this Strasbourg Convention, he was extradited to Azerbaijan, and despite all assurances given, which the Azerbaijani government gave to Hungarian government, he was given a hero's welcome, he was pardoned, and he was promoted to the rank of major. And he was given 8 years back wages with an apartment in Baku.
Sorry.
So that happened not in the last decade only.
Right, so that's a comment, right? Yeah.
Are you surprised?
It happened during a NATO training program in Budapest in 2004, I suppose.
Okay, so we have listened to a fascinating talk, which has put us out of our comfort zones and full of insights.
Right.
And thank you so much for taking such time to answer all these questions. So please join me in thanking Professor Caroline Dean.